So you're playing a tune, you're midway through your solo, the rhythm section is starting to pick up intensity, become a little more interactive. You might find your breaths starting to look like this. What did you see? These long, drawn-out breaths with relatively extended pauses before I actually started playing a line. If you find yourself feeling fatigued quickly, not being able to control your sound or your response through an entire solo, this may be the cause. Today we're not looking at any licks, any 2/5s, any transcriptions, any pentatonic scales. Instead, we're going to look at one of the most important factors that determines whether you're going to be successful as an improviser. That is how you control or don't control your breathing. What's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in this week. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about something a little bit different, talking about the foundations of laying good breathing habits. Now, as brass players, we know that we live and die by how well we can get this aspect of our playing together. This lesson is not going to be an exhaustive sort of discussion about all the different breathing things you could do. There are many. Instead, we're going to focus on one simple breathing concept that is hopefully going to help set all of these other things in motion in the right way, and I think helps us particularly as improvisers when we're talking about this aspect of our playing. That little scenario that I set out at the beginning of this lesson really showed where I found I was having a problem. I kind of realized this in my playing maybe about a year or so ago and have been working pretty steadily to kind of build good habits around breathing. I found I was just taking these long breaths that didn't really have any energy in the air, and the air was just sort of sitting there until I started playing, actually building up a lot of tension the entire time. In order to work on this, I kind of went back to some of the sources of good breathing information for us as brass players. Obviously, one of the first people that comes to mind when we think about this stuff is Arnold Jacobs. If you're not familiar with his work as a brass pedagogue, I really encourage you to check it out. He is really the source of so much of the way we think about playing a brass instrument in the modern world. He played with the Chicago Symphony kind of from the mid part of the 1900s through the 1980s, and just kind of contributed a ton of knowledge about how we play a brass instrument, and particularly how we teach and learn playing a brass instrument. As I was looking through some material of his, I came across one quote that really landed for me. Jacob says, "Very little strength can produce much motion of air. Learn about air as motion." That second sentence, air as motion, a light bulb just went off my head when I read that, and I was like, that is my problem. I think I was taking in a good volume of air, and I think my diaphragm was working. However, my air was not always moving. I think I was so focused on getting a large breath that instead of keeping that air flowing, I got that big breath, held it in, and then finally released it. And so air is motion is the concept that we want to dig into today. Once this light bulb had gone off for me, I developed a couple different exercises that I like to use to kind of work on this, and that's what we're going to go over today. The first and primary exercise we're going to talk about is one that is going to help you to keep that air moving at all times. What we're going to do is we are going to take a 1-count breath and then blow out on beat 1. So we're essentially going to breathe on beat 4, blow out on beat 1. The key is that you need to focus on breathing for all of beat 4, not 1, 2, 3, where we have that pause, but rather 1, 2, 3, where all of beat 4 is in, and then it's out on beat 1 immediately. Some people might talk about this being like a circle or a cyclical fashion of how the air is working. Now, I don't care if I get a big breath, a small breath, any of that type of stuff. It's all about just making sure I breathe for all of beat 4, and then it's out on beat 1. The amount of air doesn't matter to me in this particular exercise. I love to do this with a metronome set to about 60 to 70 beats a minute, and do a couple repetitions just with the air. Let's give that a try. I'm going to throw a metronome on. I'd really encourage you to do this along with me here today, which is maybe a little different than sometimes we do on the YouTube channel here. But really check this out and see if you can get that relaxed intake to exhale. I hear some people talk about this as the quote-unquote turnaround of the air, that process of inhaling to exhale and making sure that is as smooth and relaxed as possible. So let's give it a try. I'm going to throw the metronome on. We're going to go 4 times through this exercise. Okay, cool. We've got our metronome going here. So we're going to give this a couple tries. We're going to think about a sort of mental count off. I'll give you 1, 2, 3, breathe, blow. And our main focus, remember, is all about thinking we're breathing for all of beat 4. We're never holding that air back. It's in on that beat 4, out on beat 1. We're going to breathe out for 2 beats, rest for the final 2 counts of that measure, and then we're going to do that whole thing again where we get that 1 count breath in and then blow. So let's give it a try. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Now I'll add here that you might have noticed I was blowing through an actual aperture, like similar to how I would when I would play. Some people like to blow out through a very wide opening. That's not my personal preference for this breathing stuff, because to me, that's not really how we play. The embouchure is much more focused, in my opinion. You do what you want to do. Don't at me in the comments. There are different approaches to how we think about these breathing things, all of them which do hold some validity. So do what works best for you and you feel most confident about and is going to serve you the best. That simple exercise is step number 1. You got to do a bunch of that if you feel like you were sort of like clogged up like I was with your air. After it's feeling good off the horn, you're going to want to go to the horn. Now, Jacobs talks about really trying to do a lot of these exercises off the horn, because as soon as we grab the horn, we get all of this information, kind of unconscious, subconscious information that our body starts doing. We go back to those habits that we've already learned. He talks about that it's very difficult to break a bad habit, so instead you need to replace it with a good habit. And that's really what we're trying to do today. So if it's feeling like it's a little iffy off the horn, you probably want to stay off the horn for a little bit before you go to the instrument, because a lot of those kind of problematic breathing practices are going to be right there waiting for you when you go to the instrument. With that said, we do want to try to get to the horn, because obviously when we play, we need to be on the horn. And this is where I think I really struggled. I just never did enough of this stuff where it was like, hey, I'm going to take a good breath and then I'm actually going to play in a musical setting. To start with, we're going to do a few very simple long tone-ish exercises. We are going to put that single count breath before a middle B flat that's 2 beats long. Couple counts of rest, make sure we have time to get another good breath, do it again. And then we're going to move that through some of the different partials, down to low B flat, up to high F, up to high B flat. And again, it's all about that single count breath and getting that exhale to start right on beat 1, so that note is hopefully there. When you first start doing these, you might have some challenges getting that note to start right away and feeling like you're ready, especially if, like me, you had kind of this hiccup in the turnaround of the air. So let's give this a try. Again, I'm going to throw a metronome on to 70 beats a minute. Give this a try if you can, if you have your horn handy, see how it treats you. Cool. Incredibly simple. It can seem so redundant, but I promise you, if you feel like your air is a little clogged up, this has helped me immensely over the last year. Now you can totally hear, I totally chipped that high B flat. It's real life. I could have done another take, but I decided to just leave it in there. My embouchure, my air, and everything wasn't all lined up. I didn't really think about it. I was only focusing on the air and trying to hear that note, and it just wasn't quite there. Rather than forcing that note to come out, which is going to cause a problem for my air, I just tried again, tried to establish that good habit rather than worrying about like, oh, I just made this mistake. Everybody on YouTube is going to hear me and think that I'm horrible. Once you're feeling good about this in sort of a simple, very like controlled setting like a long tone, go ahead and throw this into some music or with some of the other stuff you're practicing. It works great in front of scales. Works really well if you're practicing different licks or 2-5-1s. In And finally, the place that I found it to be particularly potent and particularly important for me to practice was actually playing it on tunes. So hopefully you could see and hear the difference between that first example on Autumn Leaves and the one we just ended on. I think my breaths felt more relaxed. I think my playing felt more relaxed. I can tell you when I first started practicing this, it really changed my phrasing as I sort of demanded of myself, you have to rest, give yourself enough time to get a good breath that's 1 or 2 counts before the next phrase. It really just changed the way I was playing. At first, not for the better. It really made my phrasing feel stiff and sort of rigid as I was kind of stuck in like 2 bars or 4 bars all the time. I had to work on that for a little while before it became natural, and particularly even still when I'm actually playing with real rhythm section musicians and I'm not practicing, sometimes it still gets away from me a little bit as that interactive component is kind of getting there and I'm trying to go with them. Sometimes my breathing breaks down, but because I've invested some time, now if it is getting a little bit away from me, I can kind of like pull myself back, okay, get a good breath, and I find that I make better musical choices because it sort of forces me to have better phrasing because I'm actually leaving rest. The rhythm section plays something, I take a breath, I play the next phrase, and it just makes everything kind of work in a more musical fashion. The final thing I'll leave you with before we get out of here, you might be wondering, well, Sean, why do I practice something so simple? I've been breathing on beat 4 and coming in on beat 1 since I started playing trombone in 5th grade. It's very easy to get sort of wrapped up with all the technicalities of what we're doing when we're playing. Maybe it's the air, maybe it's the embouchure, maybe it's the upper register. And we sort of lose sight of what we're actually working on, and then a cascade of problems starts to occur. Jacobs talks about this idea of making music and letting sort of the unconscious part of your brain where you've established these good habits kind of do some of that heavy lifting for you. And that's what we want to do here. We're going to focus on one very simple technical thing of just making sure that the air is working, making sure it's flowing. And then that is going to set the stage for everything else to hopefully be correct, especially if you've invested the time in practicing those breathing exercises where you're in for 8, out for 8, in for 4, out for 4. You've worked on your sip breaths to learn what it feels like to expand, be relaxed, never to the point of feeling tense, and then exhaling. If you invest that time there and you set up this one simple kind of rule to follow of I'm always going to get a 1 or 2 count breath before I play a phrase, all that other stuff is bam, going to happen automatically. And then suddenly, rather than focusing on like, man, I'm out of air or I didn't get a good breath, suddenly you're just thinking about the music and thinking about what does my line need to do? What does the phrasing need to do? What is the rhythm section doing? And how am I going to come in with my melody after they've said their idea to kind of complete the picture? Cool. A little bit of different stuff today. I don't necessarily veer super heavy towards brass playing stuff on this channel because in all honesty, I don't think I'm a very good brass player. And so I oftentimes, maybe leave that to people who have that aspect of the musicianship a little bit better. Now, that's not to say that my problems with playing this instrument are not instructive for all people. I think my problems are very similar to many people, but the way that this topic interacts with our role as improvisers, I think is important and something that we can all learn from. So I'll see you in the woodshed.